Pray that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts will be acceptable in your sight. And we pray in Christ's name. Amen. You know, nowadays we talk pre-9/11, post-9/11. You know, when I was very young, a couple of months old, when not in 9/11. Hang on. When Kennedy was killed, but 9/11 now, I remember, because a lot of you that were back during that time remember people asked, do you remember where you were when President Kennedy was shot? Most of us that are in my age bracket remember where we were when we heard about 9/11 and turned on the television. I remember that after that, I was not pastoring a church at the time, but we were working out of another church not too far from here that was a large church, and the pastor called me and he says, look, you're the specialist guy in grief, and everybody's asking me all these questions, and I really don't know what to say, so we'd like to take all of our Sunday school classes and bring them together in the auditorium at one time, and I kind of want you to kind of talk to them, listen to them, sort of do a debrief and talk about all of this. And I remember the church that was not normally packed was packed. Not because they heard that we were doing any of this. But if you remember after 9/11, everybody started running, that people started coming back to church, and there was candlelight vigils everywhere, and there was all of these things. And the people that normally weren't talking about God were suddenly coming back to the church to try to make sense of what was going on. And it seems like it happens in every tragedy. In every tragedy that occurs, it either makes people bitter or better. It either causes them, to run towards God or to run away from Him. Because the question always happens, and is always asked when a tragedy strikes, where is God at? Now, other things happen because we've all faced personal tragedies in our life, but when we see a national tragedy that we all sort of pay attention to, it impacts us and we're wondering, what do we do? Now, it's interesting because I want to take a couple of side roads very quickly and talk for a moment about crisis. Because we all reach crisis points in our lives. Pam and I were talking about this the other day, and when I think about the amount of crises and trauma and things that I've dealt with people over the years, that, there's no such thing as a normal death and a normal funeral, but I've had my share of some really, crazy stuff that I've had to deal with and sort of walk through with people, and a lot of really unique circumstances. But I notice that there are some responses that people have to crisis and trauma. There's some interesting ones, and there's some ways that it affects us. When a crisis or a trauma happens, first, if you notice, it destabilizes us. You notice that? It sort of destabilizes everything. You have trouble trying to find your footing. Anybody that goes to a concert now, you're going to be looking for the exit. You're now going to be going, where can I sit? Pam and I went to the movies yesterday. Now, I always do this because I'm a little bit paranoid anyway, but I'm always looking, where's the exit if I have to get out of here? Where can I sit that's going to put me at the most strategic place so that I can get out, or I can... So now we get destabilized. And as a country now, we're thinking to ourselves, if you've ever been to Las Vegas, and we were talking about where this place is at and trying to figure out, because we've been there before, and I'm like, this guy got up on that floor and it was like, for lack of a better term, shooting fish in a barrel. He meant to do that. And so now our country is sort of destabilized again. And then when it gets destabilized, everybody starts making excuses. Everybody takes their political positions on the left or the right or the center. They blame the Republicans, blame the Democrats blame the Republicans. Everybody's blaming Russia. Everybody blames the president. And it happens in every administration. But crisis destabilizes us, and it causes us to step back and go, what do we do now? And we start to live a bit in fear. And, a good amount of fear, a good amount of being wise is smart, but living in fear where you become paralyzed is not good. But crisis, and you think about it in your life, if you've had the death of a loved one or something major like that has happened to you, you're destabilized. You're like, wait a minute, everything has now changed. Everything has now changed. So it destabilizes us. Also, if you notice, it distracts us. I don't know how many of you have been like, even if you're at work, you're like, I wonder what's going on. I wonder if they found what this guy's done yet. I wonder. We get distracted by this. We get distracted. We're watching the news and we see all the crises that occurred with the hurricanes, and we see the people in Puerto Rico, and we see all of these other different things going on. And so it distracts us a lot of times from even fulfilling our purpose, because we're empathizing, we're sympathizing, and we're like, man, what can we do? So there's a destabilization that occurs. There's a distraction that occurs, but there's something else that happens with crisis. I'm going to put it like this, so I can put another D in there. It displays us. It reveals who we are. Crisis and trauma doesn't shape us. It reveals us. It's what we've talked about for years, and you've heard me say it over and over, the coffee cup test. If you're holding hot coffee and somebody bumps you, what's your first reaction? That's what's going to come out, because that's what's really inside. Crisis has a tendency to sort of squeeze us. And then what happens when crisis and trauma happens to us, we often let it then define us. We actually let it define who we are. And worse, I see this happening with people. It not only defines us, but then we allow the crisis and the trauma and the devastation and the disaster to actually shape our theology of God. We don't allow God to shape our theology of crisis. So you ever notice this? A crisis happens and people say, I thought God was loving. You ever notice that? There's evil in the world. Somebody does something and immediately they go, I thought God was loving. So they let evil shape their belief and their theology about who God is. It really winds up defining us. So where is He when all this is going on? How do we really look at crisis, at trauma, at any of these events that happen? And more importantly, if we are followers of Jesus, we should respond like He does. And how you think that you respond. And I'm not making fun of people, but, it is so easy on Facebook to put thoughts and prayers, heart. Thoughts and prayers. Thoughts and prayers. That's good. Prayer is a good thing. But sometimes it's the easiest thing for us to do, and it may not be what Jesus really wants us to do in that moment. That's really hard. There's not a better story, I don't think. There's others in the Scripture. We could have gone to John 11, but this is a great story. And I'll tell you why, and you'll see what I'm talking about in just a moment. So let me give you the background as to what has happened. If you hadn't picked up on it when you were first reading this, we are post-resurrection. Now, it's interesting because as we pick up this story, here's Cleopas, who is one of the outer band of the disciples, one of sort of the extended ring of disciples. He's not one of the inner 12 or now the inner 11. And there's questions of whether Cleopas was also a guy by the name of Alphaeus. Well, we don't know. Different theologians talk about different things, and it's hard to really determine that. But no matter, Cleopas was one of the extended followers of Jesus. Now, what had just happened that day in Jerusalem was a tragedy, a travesty that everybody had heard about. Because you see, they executed a rabbi. And they didn't execute him, we don't get to see it on TV. We'll see when they're going to execute somebody possibly, and they have people that are there, and they're sort of witnesses, and they do the whole thing where they call the governor. Governor's not going to issue a stay, and then afterwards they come on and tell you the person died. No. That's not how this worked. Not with the Romans. What happened with the Romans is that they had that death by asphyxiation, which is what crucifixion was. And those of you that have heard me talk about it at Easter, they would pull up on the cross to take a breath, but then the pressure was so great on their diaphragm and on their rib cage that they could only exhale, and they would have to pull up against that cross to take another breath, which is why the soldiers would come along and would break their legs, so they couldn't breathe anymore. It was literally death by asphyxiation or suffocation. And they were naked before everybody. Everybody that wanted to go and witness this, it was like a public hanging, but it was worse. It would go on for hours and hours. It was a marathon. until these soldiers would come by and would finally end it. So here's a guy named Jesus who was nothing more than a rabbi that was teaching people, but the religious leaders got all concerned about the fact that this was going to become a movement, and that maybe he was who he says he was, but we're not sure, but he's gaining a lot more traction and a lot more following than us, so we have to figure some way, come up with something that we can go after him with and get rid of him. And so they did. And remember, the trials went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and all of this nonsense happened until finally Jesus is crucified. Now, just imagine his followers, because they had all sort of scattered. There were a few at the cross, but there was only a few there. Though some of the main disciples were gone or were following him at a distance, and they watched this go on for 6 hours. And the guy who said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." The guy who said to Lazarus, when everybody was freaked out because Lazarus was dead, and they were all asking, "Where were you at?" He's the guy that said, after he said that to Martha, he said, "Lazarus, come out." He's a guy that raised people from the dead, that made the lame walk again, that caused the blind to see, that caused the people who couldn't hear. I mean, it was on and on and on. And they were like, maybe he's the one. It's over like that. 6 hours, he's gone. Take his body off, put him in the grave, a borrowed grave that he's in. It was donated. So he goes into that, and then suddenly it's 3 days later, and now there's all these reports that he's missing. Well, of course, the Roman soldiers, they're doing their part by saying, well, somebody came and stole his body. That's the problem. They put the seal, but somebody came and took it, and then there's these people saying, "Oh, I saw a ghost," and it was him. It was a ghost. So they're finding this absolutely unbelievable. They have no idea what's going on. So these two guys are making the 7-mile walk to Emmaus. They're upset because a tragedy has taken place that everybody knew about, that everybody saw, and word has spread like you would not believe. Everybody, they didn't have CNN, they didn't have Fox News, they didn't have MSNBC, they didn't have radio, they didn't have internet, they didn't have anything like that. This was all word of mouth, that this had been spread, and everybody in the city knew about it, and there's no way that you couldn't know about it. It's kind of like now. It's like, if you say to somebody, "Man, it's crazy what happened in Las Vegas," and somebody looks at you and goes, "What happened in Las Vegas?" You're like, "Really? Like how disconnected are you that you don't know what happened in Las Vegas?" So here's these guys, they're walking along, they're upset, they're down, because see, they had put their hope in this guy. And all at once, in a tragedy, he's executed publicly. And they're wondering, what's going to be next? And so that's where we pick up the story in here in Luke. And so notice what happens. And we'll go back to jump back up to verse 13. So they're walking along and making the 7-mile journey. They're talking to each other about everything that happened. Verse 15, they talk and discuss. Jesus, notice it says Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. It's kind of like, didn't want to walk the 7 miles long, so he kind of goes up and starts saying, like, "Hey guys, how you doing? Oh yeah, come on and walk with us." And then they were kept from recognizing. He said, "Hey, what are you guys talking about? Maybe I could get in on the conversation." And they stopped. And it said they stood still with their faces to the ground. They're downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, looked at him and said, "Wait a minute, are you like the only one that's visiting Jerusalem today that didn't know the things that have happened here in these days? Like, are you the only guy? Are you the only person? Everybody knows what's happened. How can you not know this?" And so Jesus says, what things? And then he says about Jesus of Nazareth, that he was a prophet, he was powerful in word and deed for God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all of this took place, and now some of the women amazed us, and they went to the tomb this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and told us they'd seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see Jesus. I have a feeling that's how they did it. Just rehashing the whole thing. You imagine? Now what's so cool about this is we've got hindsight. I want you to see how Jesus responded to this. Even though he was there, even though he is God, even though he was the one that this had happened to, and even though he was the one that had risen from the dead and had done the miracle, he says to them, what's happening? What's going on? And notice, he lets them go on and on and on ad nauseum, telling the story. And Jesus is probably thinking to himself, been there, done that, got the t-shirt, I lived it. Oh, I know how you feel. You should know how I feel. This happened to me, and I did it for you. Nope, nothing. He says, nothing. He doesn't go into anything with them. He actually literally just lets them talk about this whole thing. And yet he's God, he's in control. Like I would have said to them, will you guys be quiet? Listen, let me tell you what happened. You guys don't see who I am? Nope. Let's go. Then he says to them, watch this. He says, how foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. So now they're picking up, this guy may be a teacher, but they still haven't recognized him. You're like, man, don't you... And the way this is written, it's like, don't you guys remember what the prophets said? I mean, Jesus is acting like, well, this doesn't surprise me, because they said, this is what's going to happen. And then he says, did not the Messiah have to suffer all these things and then enter his glory? And notice what it says Jesus did. He goes back to Scripture, and he says, in the beginning, with Moses and the prophets, he explained to them what was said in the Scriptures concerning himself. So what does he do? He goes back, so he lets them get the emotions out. He lets them sort of get emotional and say all their stuff, and they're downcast. And then he goes, well, listen, let me go back to something. Let's go back to what we know. Let's go back to what we believe. And why don't we realize that this is exactly what the prophet said were going to happen? And so Jesus now comes back at them, but he doesn't preach. He just goes through the Scriptures and says, well, this is how all of this was supposed to happen with the Messiah. You guys know that. You don't remember your lessons when you were at synagogue, so you need to remember this. And so they're going along doing their thing, and here it is. They approached the village where they were going. And Jesus, I always love when I see this, Jesus was just going to go farther. I'm so reminded of when he was walking on the water, and one of the Gospels records that the disciples were out there straining at the oars, and Jesus is walking on the water. One of the Gospels records that he was intending to pass them by. He was going to go past them. Jesus, the intention was for him to keep going, but these guys had connected with this guy. They didn't still know who he was, and so they were going to go farther, but they urged him strongly. Literally, they begged him. They were like, hey, man, listen. Don't travel. It's getting dark. There's no street lights. There's people out there going to rob you. Why don't you come and hang out with us? Have a little dinner and you can get going the next day. So he went in. The intention was to do what? To stay with them. I love it. This is so good and so significant. He says, notice what Luke says. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, he gave thanks, he goes to distribute it, and boom, they recognized him. They were like, oh, it's Jesus. And then it says he disappeared from their sight. They were like, man, something was going on inside of us when he was here, but we couldn't put our finger. Our hearts were burning while he talked with us on the road, and he opened the scriptures to us, and then at once, get this, they know it's Jesus because Jesus is now saying, look, I'm right here. I'm here. It's all true. And notice, they got up and they took the 7-mile journey back on foot. It's evening. They found the 11 who were assembled together, and they said, it's true, the Lord has risen and appeared to Simon. And then the two told them what happened and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. It's interesting because when you look at this story, the question is, where is God in the midst of tragedy? That's always the question. And it begins, people look at that, they go, well, I don't see God, I didn't hear him, and the thing is that there's evil in the world, and so God has somehow lost control, or there is no God, because if there was, then he would stop it. I don't know whether you understand the significance of this story. Because Jesus said to them, what are you talking about? What are you doing? What are you guys discussing? And they're like, man, don't you know? And their hearts were broken and they were downcast. And he let them talk about all the evil that had been done to him. All the evil that not only was he in the midst of it and that they witnessed, but it had been done to him. And he's not even saying, look, it's me, it happened to me. He's saying, but the evil was going to happen because this is what the scriptures told us. See, I'm surprised when people are surprised that there's evil in the world. You know, well, why did the guy do this? Was he this? Was he that? Was he this party affiliation? Was he this religion? No. He was a sinner. He may have had some kind of motivation. But folks, if you haven't figured it out, there's evil people in the world. There's a heads and there's a tails. There's a God and there's a devil. There's good and there's evil. And we're not going to know what good is without seeing that evil sometimes. Here's the kicker. Jesus knew and God knew that evil was going to happen to him. He knew that he was going to be crucified on a cross, that he was going to suffer for 6 hours, the worst humiliation, the worst type of death, and it all being done unjustly, and God didn't stop it. And Jesus said to them, see, guys, what you don't understand is there's evil. And this evil was predicted. And it was going to happen. And he told them this. God said, the scripture said this. There's going to be evil in the world, and all this is going to happen. And then what happens? They're talking about all this, and they're over, and they're talking about the scriptures, and they're talking about what happened. And I'm sure it's emotionally exhausting. And they said, look, why don't you come in and sit down with us? He sits down, and he breaks the bread, and he gives thanks. And just as he goes to pass it out, they may have been around and watched him do Passover before. All of a sudden the lights came on and he was gone. They were like, our hearts were burning. And what Jesus showed them is, listen, when there's evil and you're asking where I am, I'm there. I'm in the building. I'm at the concert. I'm with the people that are throwing their bodies over somebody else to keep them from being hit. I've never, ever left. And don't let evil shape your theology of who I am. Let who I am shape how you look at that. See, when there is a tragedy that goes on, I don't ask anymore, where is God? It doesn't shake me one iota that God's not there. You know what I do? I look at it and go, okay, God was there, and who is His representative in this world? We are, as we've talked about so often, church, need to be the hands and the feet of Jesus. So the next question that I will often say is, I remember a song that used to say, you're the only Jesus some will ever see. You're the only words of life that some people may ever read. And so it's up to me to be Jesus to these people. And you know what Jesus did? He showed them. He was with them. He was present with them physically. He didn't lecture them. He didn't go after. He let them talk about all the emotions and all the stuff and went back and said, well, yeah, all of this is predicted. And then He sat down and He had a meal with them. And boom, He was gone. And they were like, wow, He was here. I heard somebody call it the ministry of presence. See, I'm not downgrading thoughts and prayers. The first time everybody goes to Facebook now and they thoughts and prayers and hearts and this and that and praying hands and all that good stuff, and all of that's wonderful and it's great, and you can pass all of that on, and then if you want to digress into a political argument about gun control and no gun control and you're going to do this and they're going to do that and go, if you want to go through all of that, go right ahead, but I'm going to submit to you as a believer, you're off focus on that if you're not trying to do something. See, what was cool was the people that said, well, I'm going to go donate blood. In the hurricanes, it was people that were actually going to try to go and do something or give. If you can do nothing but pray, pray. But the point is that God calls us when we can to have the ministry of presence. There's nothing like being there when we can be there with people. There's nothing like being. I can't tell you the times. The other day I got just a beautiful Facebook message from a woman that I had been there, and most of you don't know her. She's never been to this church. If I read you the message that she sent, and I was trying to remember what exactly did I do. I did her husband's funeral. She had asked me to come by and see him right before he died. I went by, I prayed with him. I prayed with the family. I knew her from another association, organization. They called me, I did the funeral. We talked a little bit after that, and that was it. And she went through this, you were there, blah, blah, and I was like, I didn't do anything except just be there. And apparently it meant more than I knew. Sometimes He calls us to be like Him and be there, because you ever think about this? We celebrate Christmas not too long from now. It's a little scary, isn't it? Somebody said the other day it was like 81 days or something like that. We're going to celebrate Emmanuel. You know what Emmanuel means? God with us. And I think especially this year, as we move into that season, that we think about the fact that when God wanted to tell us He loved us, He came. When He needed to minister to these disciples at that moment who were downtrodden, who needed assurance, He came. He was there. Where is God in the tragedy? He's there. And He's there in the form of us to reach out to other people. That doesn't mean we're God. Don't anybody take that and run with it. We're His representatives to reach out to people in the midst of it. Not to lecture them, but to listen. Maybe to open up and to eat with them and to let them talk and to encourage them and to do what we can do. Pray. Act. Do what you can do. But I don't ask anymore, where is God in the tragedy? Because what I know is a tragedy doesn't shape God. God, my view of God, shapes how I look at the tragedy. He's always there. There will always be evil in the world. But then there are always going to be those people that'll plug a bullet hole with their finger. That'll lay on top of somebody to keep them from being shot. That'll load people in a pickup truck who are wounded and get them to the hospital. There are always people that'll give blood, that'll donate money, that'll do use their gifts and their talents and their abilities, whatever it is, to make a difference there. He's there, and He expects us to be there. Let's pray.